Hi guys. We're just going to wait for them to take a seat.
And then afterwards.
I think you can, yeah, you want to see it. All right. Thank you all for coming. Let me welcome you, first of all on behalf of the Kevorkian Center for Near Eastern Studies. I'm going to make brief introductions to our speakers, and then I think Andrew will speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, and each of our discussants will have anywhere between 10 to 15 minutes on their own. So we are very excited to have with us tonight Andrew Ross, who will be presenting his new book, Men of Stone. Andrew is, of course, a professor of social and cultural analysis at NYU. He's the author of a long list of books, including Creditocracy and the Case for Debt Refusal, Bird on Fire, Lessons from the World's Least Sustainable City, Nice Work If You Can Get It, Life and Labor in Precarious Times, Fast Boat to China, Lessons from Shanghai, and No Collar, The Humane Workplace and Its Hidden Costs. His forthcoming book, which he's going to be presenting from today, is, as I said, Stone Men. It's published by Verso. We have with us two very distinguished discussants. Greg Grandin, who is professor of history at NYU and author of also a long list of books. Thankfully, I only have two of them here. Portlandia and recently The End of the Myth. We're also joined by Nadia Abu El-Haj of Columbia University, who is, of course, a professor in anthropology at Barnard and Columbia. She is also co-director, I should say, of the Center for Palestine Studies there at Columbia. She is the recipient of numerous awards, including one from the Social Science Research Council, the Van Grant Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, the Harvard Academy for Area and International Studies, and the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, as well as the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation. She's the author of numerous journal articles published on topics ranging from the history of archaeology in Palestine to the question of race and genomics today. She has published two books, Facts on the Ground, Archaeological Practice and Territorial Self-Fashioning in Israeli Society. That was in 2001, which won the Albert Mourani Annual Book Award from the Middle East Studies Association in 2002. And more recently, the Genealogical Science, The Search for Jewish Origins and the Politics of Epistemology. That was 2012. While her last two books have focused on historical sciences, her third book, tentatively titled, as I understand, Caring for Militarism, Soldier Trauma, the Obligations of Citizenship and the Forever War, examines the field of military psychiatry and explores the complex ethical and political implications of shifting psychiatric and public understandings of the trauma of soldiers. So as I said, 20 to 25 minutes? Yes, that's good. And then 15 each. Please join me in welcoming our guests.
Let me grab this, just in case you can't hear me. Hello, people. Is this on?
Yeah, it's on.
It is on?
Whenever I hear it.
Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming this evening, and Nasser for the introduction, and I'm especially honored to have Greg and Nadia here as respondents. Before I begin, let's acknowledge that we are meeting here on occupied homelands of Lenape peoples, and the fact that that occupation has some resonance and significance for the topic that we're going to be discussing this evening. I want to begin by just saying a few words about my point of entry into the region, which really, with 40 years ago, I spent a few months on a kibbutz in the Galilee, on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, kibbutz Ginusar. And the region was in a lot of turmoil at the time. The Israeli forces had just come back from invading southern Lebanon, and the campaign to Judaize the Galilee, which is an ongoing campaign, even today, had been stepped up. So there had been a lot of land appropriation and evictions going on. And indeed, Yigal Allon, who some of you will know something about Alon's career, he was the most famous resident of the kibbutz I was on, and this was a man who, among other things, wrote in his memoirs about his efforts to cleanse the Galilee, this is the term that he used, in 1948. And in addition, he was, he was actually the commander of Operation Broom at the time, as in, sweep away the residents of the Galilee. I was put to work in the grapefruit orchards. This is me. As you can see, 40 years ago, I was a bit of a hippie. Actually, I still am a hippie. Sometimes I was in banana fields, and at the end of one of the shifts, there were two men that walked away from my work crew towards the Tiberias Road, and they didn't have the loose-limbed swagger of the typical kibbutznik male. So I figured, these are Palestinian day laborers, probably. And I got it into my head I should ask them some questions. You know, who are you? Where do you live? How much are you paid? How do you feel about working on lands that have probably been stolen from your forefathers and foremothers? But I never got the chance to ask the questions. I left to travel in Egypt shortly thereafter and didn't return to the region until 35 years later at the invitation of a friend, Amin Hussein, Palestinian-American filmmaker who was making a film there, and Amin wanted me to come and interview workers at checkpoints for the film. Now, we had previously been in Abu Dhabi. We'd done a lot of work in Abu Dhabi exposing the conditions of migrant workers in Abu Dhabi. And I had been barred from entry there, and several of our comrades had also been barred from entry. So when we came to Palestine, we kind of transferred our energies and attention, and we realized we were talking to migrant workers in their own land, in a sense, a related but somewhat different proposition from the South Asian migrant workers in Abu Dhabi. And I realized in the first interviews I did with workers that I was finally asking the questions that I had lately formulated for myself 35 years before. So I decided to go ahead and do further research, interviews, write the book. Why? Well, believe it or not, there's not a whole lot written about Palestinian livelihoods, which astonished me a little bit when I went and did my research, my due diligence. And in addition, from a public perspective, from the perspective of Palestine watchers, even the solidarity movement, the focus is usually on other things. You know, land theft, evictions, demolitions, human rights violations, soldier brutality, incarceration, and so on and so forth. And all for very good reason. But there is not so much knowledge of and attention to what Palestinians do on a daily basis to put food on the table for their families. In addition, I found out also quite astonishing, I don't know if you can read any of this, I couldn't find one single published study of the stone industry in the West Bank. And that astonished me, because the stone industry is the largest private sector employment of Palestinian workers in the West Bank. It contributes the largest share of GDP, the largest share of exports from the occupied territories, and for such a small population, Palestinians are the 12th largest stone producer in the world, just behind the US and above Russia. The stone in the region, along with the water, these are the two natural resources that are in short supply in Israel. A lot of the water is siphoned off by Israelis and settlers from the mountain aquifer using advanced pumping technologies. And as for the stone, well, there's a lot of it. That's a geological map of the stone deposits in the Central Highlands. It's some of the best dolomitic limestone in the world. And it's still largely under Palestinian ownership and somewhat under Palestinian control, although there are constraints on the industry, which I'm going to talk about a little bit. What happens to the stone once it's extracted? Some of it's used in the region, some of it goes to other countries in the Middle East. Most of it, 75% of it, goes inside the Green Line to Israel and to the settlements. And what that means is, ironically, the very contents of Palestinian land are being used to build out the state of Israel and the spreading archipelago of settlements that are in the West Bank. Sometimes referred to as Palestine's white oil, and it is something of a resource curse in that regard, especially from an environmental perspective. It is a very under-regulated industry, and the strip mining of the stone sickens workers and ravages the environment, which is a big problem. The production chain is maybe 1,200 firms. The stone comes from the quarries, it gets cut and fabricated and polished and dressed and brushed in the factories and workshops, and then it goes across the Green Line, most of it, to construction sites in Israel. in the ever-expanding suburbs of Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem. So I realized pretty early on, of course, that the stone doesn't travel on a company. It's accompanied by labor in the form of native skills and manpower. So I decided that I would do these interviews at every point in the chain, in that chain that leads from the quarries to the construction sites. So I interviewed in the quarries, I interviewed workers in the factories here, I interviewed workers in the workshops, and then at the checkpoints. I did about 200 interviews at various checkpoints. And then on the construction sites inside the Green Line. And then also did interviews with workers coming back across from the checkpoints. There's a different quality of interview when workers are coming back, some of them in a great hurry. And often there's very little time left in the day, and it's basically from bed to work and from work to bed in the case of workers who are inside the Green Line. Very little time in the day left for their families. And I also interviewed workers who were employed in the settlements, especially in villages that were close to the settlements and were being encroached upon and having their land gradually taken. And that was a particularly harrowing experience. Small family owners. This is an industry that is the same family names come up again and again, which means that it's under-capitalized, it's under-professionalized, and largely under-regulated. Because it's village-based and the families know each other and have been in business for a long, long time, they compete carefully with each other. This is a very particular form of capitalism I call careful competition. It's quite distinct from the comprador capitalist economy which circulates around the Palestinian Authority, the sort of infamous crony capitalist circle that monopolizes utility provision and food provision through Padico, which is the holding company for it. There are some unions. The workers' unions are pretty weak, but certainly compared to the Trade Association of the Owners, which is a union of stone and marble. And all sorts of reasons why they're weak, but one of them, I think, being that if you read Palestine's basic law, the economic system in Palestine shall be based on the principles of a free market economy. That's pretty unique. I don't know of any other country in the world that stipulates that a free market economy has to be the basic operating system. What that means, among other factors, is that there's a sort of general discouragement of overt forms of class conflict in the name of national unity, and this is magnified by the free market economics. Palestinian trade union history, of course, is very rich and it's quite fragmented and varied, but in recent years there's been an upsurge of new unions that work independently of the orbit of the PGF-TU, which is the main trade union federation. And likewise in Israel, there are a few new unions that are operating independently of the Histadrut and central authorities. And there's a kind of sporadic, informal cooperation across the Green Line between these union formations. It can't be too overt because it's not cool to do that. In most circles, it's sort of politically discouraged, but there are some wins and gains. Here we are as the first workers taking a vote on the first union contract in an industrial settlement zone. In a settlement industrial zone. It's very difficult to organize in these zones, but this was a big win, and also there have been some wins inside Israel itself. This is a picture, I forgot about this. This is, I interviewed a lot of factory owners, and they complain about, the usual things that owners complain about, employers, their workers, and high wages, and so on and so forth. But in particular, they complain about the constraint, quite rightly, the constraints placed upon the industry by the occupation regime. One example is Palestinian extractors can't use explosives, so they have to use machines to basically saw the stone out of the ground, which is a considerable disadvantage when you're competing with producers in other countries and with the handful of Israeli-owned crushers in Area C. Invariably, after my interviews with owners, they would take me to their homes, which were fairly lavish hilltop residences, and there would be an hour or so of traditional Palestinian hospitality. But I was being taken there, I realized, not just these are a showpiece for the stones that are the product of the firm, but also they're trophy homes, displaying and demonstrating the wealth of the owners. And so most of these owners are doing pretty well, quite frankly, at least compared to the workers. In my interviews, as you can imagine, the psychology of working for the occupier, the humiliation of working for the occupier comes out in all sorts of ways in the interviews, and impacts the profile of masculinity that attaches to the profile of the male breadwinner. This is a profoundly masculine trade. There are some women working in the industry, some of them in upper reaches of management that I found, mostly in clerical occupations. However, this psychology of humiliation was especially acute, again, as you can imagine, for those who are working in settlements and for those who are laboring on the separation wall itself, because a lot of Palestinians involved in constructing the wall. I picked out this quote, which tries to summarize, a quote from one of my interviewees, which tries to summarize the blindingly obvious asymmetry on the landscape. We build their houses while they demolish our homes, and I want you to pay particular attention to the distinction there between houses and homes. The occupier has houses, and we have homes, and they're being demolished. There were a lot of opinions expressed, again, as you can imagine, about the Palestinian Authority, not very high opinions, and about the occupation, even worse, and but also an awareness, a particular awareness about how the livelihoods of these workers have been tossed around as colonial bargaining chips over the decades. And for those of you who know about Israeli policy of economic pacification, this is the jobs for peace policy. Basically, we'll issue you with a work permit as long as you keep the peace. And if you step out of line, or anyone in your family steps out of line, you lose that permit. It's a very effective policy and very finely honed. But ultimately, I was just as interested in documenting the daily life of these workers as they go about their routines. And what struck me really overall was their resilience. The fact that they show up and have showed up decade after decade to fill these slots in the production chain. And it's just showing up for work, in a sense, despite all of the indignities and obstacles thrown in their paths, that struck me as somewhat reflective of the resistance philosophy of Sumud, which is a very important philosophy for Palestinians. The stone industry is kind of structured around the remnants of the very venerable craft of stone masonry. Palestinian stonemasons have been venerated for centuries, sought out for their superior artisanal skills, and some of them are still doing this kind of handmade work, piecework in the factories and quarries. They basically do, historically they've done what's often called architecture without architects, which means that in every large village a master mason would be designing and building, without any professional training, would be designing and building and passing on know-how and tools and technology to each generation. And these are some examples. Of course, they built many palaces, they built many hilltop villages. This is Aboin, just below Rawabi, if you know that area. They built township cores. This is Bir Zaid. And then from the mid-19th century onwards, they got into the business of city building. This is Jaffa. They built Jaffa, they built Jerusalem, they built Hebron, they built Nablus, they built Haifa, they built Akka, they built, and finally, of course, they built Tel Aviv, the first Hebrew city. And from the 1960s onwards, they were building in other parts of the region. This is Amman in Jordan. Palestinians built Amman. And when the post-colonial Gulf states needed their skills for nation building, they went there and they built these. And the Palestinians were the preferred workforce in the Gulf states before the South Asian replacement migrant force was brought in. So it's no exaggeration to say that Palestinians have built almost every state in the region, except their own. And that includes Israel. This is the debate which I get into in the book about who built Israel. In the public mind, of course, the given wisdom is that the settlers and the pioneers built Israel. They were unused to manual labor. They learned on the job. They staffed the cement mixers. They balanced the bricks awkwardly on their shoulders. And they made new Jews of themselves through that nation-making toil. Or at least according to the doctrine of labor Zionism. Now, the labor part of this story is a little murky. If you leave aside the Zionist mythology, it's a little murky. And it's long been obscured by the agrarian romance of the communalistic kibbutz, whose economic origins, for those of you might not know, the economic origins of the kibbutz lay in a solution to the quest that Jewish settlers had how to extract a European standard of living from a Middle Eastern agricultural livelihood. Right? It's not obvious how you would do that. There were all sorts of failed attempts to do that among Zionist settlers. The kibbutz was a solution to this problem largely because of the pooled resources, the pooled communal resources which provided the economic solution. In the urban sector, there was even less clarity. A lot of the settlers, the Jewish settlers, were socialists. They demanded their labor rights, and they demanded a European wage as opposed to an Arab wage, which is the local market wage at the time. And they got that largely, and how did they get that? Because of world Zionist funding that subsidized the wage and topped it up from the Arab wage to the European wage. And that is the origin of the long-enduring, to this day, pattern of world Zionist funding that subsidizes Israel's economic development. In addition, there was a famous or infamous conquest of labor, which was a campaign to put pressure on Jewish employers and foreign employers to exclude Arabs from their workforce. And there was a lot of rhetoric around this and a lot of sound and fury around it, but it was only ever partially successful. I think the historical record shows that. Why? Because employers then and now have always preferred Palestinian Arab labor. At that time, they were cheaper, they were better, they had centuries of construction experience in the region. Why would you not prefer that workforce? And even today, as I say, there's still that preference. There are additional reasons today for that preference, which I can go into, but let me just mention what I call the Battle of Tel Aviv, which is an interesting case study in the book. In Jaffa, the stonemasons of Jaffa, which at the time had, before 1948 had 100,000 people. This is the cultural and economic center of Palestine. Reduced to 4,000 after the Nakba. The stonemasons of Jaffa worked with this stone, which is kurkar, which is a sandstone, basically lithified sand dunes. And when the world Zionist funders of this new settlement of Tel Aviv laid down this principle that only Jewish hands would build Tel Aviv, this presented a problem because all of the skilled masons in that part of the world worked with this stone, and they were indispensable, absolutely indispensable. Who would want anyone else to build their houses? So the solution to this, from the point of view of the decision makers of Tel Aviv, was to find a substitute for this stone that was not local, and meant they wouldn't have to rely on the stonemasons. So what they did was they invented silicate bricks, and then they started using cement and concrete. Principle that those materials could be worked by less skilled hands, in other words, by Jewish hands. This was a technological solution to a labor problem from the point of view of the settlers. And concrete went on to become a kind of cult within Israel. Concrete became the signature mark of Israeli modernity after 1948, and because the material is sort of tough and unyielding and durable, it's supposed to reflect the character of the new Jewish state. And today, of course, the march of concrete across the hilltops of the West Bank is the sort of unsavory brand mark of the occupation. But just remember that the original reason for adopting these materials was to exclude Palestinians from the workforce. Now, at the same time, there's something going on which I call architectural cleansing from 1948 at least until 1967, which is the effort to eradicate all of the physical remnants of the Ottoman era, all of the built heritage. That involved demolition of villages and makeover of a lot of urban quarters, vast demolition on a vast scale, which is happening at the same time as urban renewal in other parts of the world, but this had a local political significance. That flight, the Zionist flight away from the built heritage of the region, goes into reverse after 1967. Why is that? Well, largely because of the occupation in Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem, and Nadia's book, of course, her wonderful book, is a brilliant analysis of how the work of the biblical archaeologists, which is kind of religiously driven crusade to look at stones through a new lens. The old stones of Palestine were no longer seen as the crumbling remnants of a backward civilization. Now they were seen as, kind of magical pathways to the landscape of Jewish antiquity. And so this was largely religiously driven, but at the same time there was a more secular movement afoot, which had to do with the real estate value of old stone. And again, this is something that's happened all over the world too. There's a renewed appreciation for vintage decor and crumbling facades and so on and so forth. Anything that's antique suddenly has a lot of real estate value. And this is the shift towards neo-traditionalist taste, and it brings in gentrification, and it brings in this sort of renewed appreciation of traditional, these are arabesque features in architecture and so on and so forth, and vast amounts of money in the real estate appreciation of such buildings. When I started reporting in Jaffa 2015, what I call Ottomania, this new appreciation of all things Ottoman, had reached fever pitch, and some of the old buildings around the old city of Jaffa were fetching the highest real estate prices in Israel, which is just mind-blowing if you consider, and not that long before, that the bulldozers were leveling these buildings. And lo and behold, Kurkar, that the stone that had been shunned a century earlier by Tel Avivians was now in hot demand, along with workers who could work with Kurkar, and they were very few and far between. And for those of you who know this site, this is around the old French hospital in Jaffa, which is being, this Kurkar wall was being constructed. It actually fell down, they had to rebuild it because the workers really weren't that familiar with the material. So the other part of this story has to do with what's happening 25 kilometers east of Jaffa, across the Green Line. There's also been a revival of interest in old buildings, in vintage stone and mortar buildings, but not for real estate reasons, not for market reasons in the West Bank. This has to do with interest in Palestinian cultural heritage, and also for a variety of political factors that have to do with land retention, restored buildings and town centers and villages are bulwarks against settler theft. and they're evidence of long-standing Palestinian residence on the land. These are Palestinian facts on the ground, and they're often spoken about that way. In my book, I really looked at 3 organizations that were doing this kind of restoration work, ReWalk and Ramallah, and the Center for Cultural Heritage in Bethlehem, and the Old City Revitalization Program in Jerusalem. They're all different locations, so they do different kinds of work. Here's an example of a restoration of the old village core of Jabba, which is just east of Jerusalem. This is before and this is after. It's quite a transformation, as you can see. I interviewed a lot of the workers who were employed on those projects. Some of them were old-timers that still knew the craft. They'd been handed down to them. And others were younger and were learning this craft on the job. So, just to conclude then, what I want to say is that my review of the employment record in the construction industry confirmed what a lot of scholars have suspected and in fact argued, that Palestinians have always been involved in construction. A century of toil, and from the Ottoman era, where settlers were entirely dependent on their skills, through the Mandate period, a sort of long wave of expansion during the Mandate. We built all the infrastructure in British Mandate. After the Nakba, building houses to accommodate incoming waves of Jewish immigrants, and after 67, when a large reservoir of cheap labor opens up in the West Bank and in Gaza. Ever since then, Israeli employers have found it very difficult to shake off their dependency on West Bank Palestinians in particular, and in spite of the attempts every so often to bring in replacement workforces, Mizrahi Jews after the Nakba, and migrant workers from overseas after the first Intifada, which is a sort of collective punishment exacted upon Palestinians for the Intifada. Today, there's never been more West Bank Palestinians working inside the Green Line and in the settlements, with or without permits. There's a numerical height according to the statistics. My research showed there was only one small window when the workforce was relatively Arab-free, and that was after 1948, when Palestinians who remained inside Israel, the new state of Israel, survivors, were under military lockdown and could not leave their villages. And it was only a matter of years, maybe even months actually, before they were once again found on construction sites, however. And so they've had a decisive hand in most of the fixed assets on the land, from the river to the sea. So what has that gotten Palestinians, and what rights accrue from that century or more of labor? This is a question the book asks ultimately. In the form of sweat equity, this principle that if you build a country, that should translate into political rights within that country. And what additional forms of restitution are due for a compulsory workforce? Because Palestinians were fashioned into a compulsory workforce after 1948 and 67. Not forced labor, but certainly not a free labor condition. Somewhere in between, which I call compulsory labor. When negotiations begin again, if and when they begin again, over final status, all of the old claims will still be on the table from the Palestinian side, like restitution for lost property from the Nakba and the long Nakba, compensation for moral suffering, decades of moral suffering, the right of return for refugees. These are all reparative debts, reparative justice debts from the past that have to be repaid. But what about the future? What about the future in the unitary state, the one state, the so-called one-state solution? How does the century of labor and the sweat equity accumulated in that century of labor, how will it translate, how could it translate into claims made on civil and political rights in this future unitary state? That's my speculative question that the book puts on the table. If you look at other parts of the world and say, well, how is that worked elsewhere? I mean, the honest answer would be not very well. Bonded and indentured and enslaved and ethnically persecuted immigrant workforces who built other countries have found it very hard to get sort of state-level recognition for their rights on behalf of their labor. Look at the U.S. The hard labor of African-American, Chinese, Mexican, Irish, other immigrant populations hasn't necessarily translated on that basis, on the basis of that argument, into full inclusion and citizenship. Although I think over time it's fair to say that the moral argument for labor-based equity has fed into the full civic and legal acceptance of these laboring populations and their citizenship rights. But in Palestine, the case seems to me even actually much stronger, because these are not populations that came from elsewhere, whether voluntarily or not. These are populations that are laboring on their own ancestral lands, which makes a big difference and strengthens, I think, the case for the claim that I'm putting on the table. I'll just end with this quote from a worker who I interviewed at one of the checkpoints. He was about to go across and work on an Israeli construction site. He said, "I've been building homes over there every day for 30 years. In a way, it's really my country too, isn't it?" And I think that kind of summarizes the art in a very neat and blunt and articulate way what I've been using $25 words to try and summarize in this talk. So I'm going to end there with that. Thank you.
Nasser, do you have an order for it?
Sorry, you choose.
Yeah, it's entirely up to you. How's it going?
You want to go? But are we gonna? Are we all gonna? Are we gonna?
Whatever. Do you want to sit down here or
I
stand?
can do either. I just need my computer.
Okay. Well, let's all sit down.
Let's all sit down.
Shall we?
Unfortunately, I didn't have time to print, so I'm a little behind.
If you want, you could just go.
No, I don't. Okay, whatever. I'll just go. Okay, so first, thank you so much for inviting me to do this. And now I'm getting guilty. Counting in a very serious way.
Sorry.
No, you're right. So, again, I learned an extraordinary amount from this book about stone, both as a resource and as a kind of a long-standing profession that actually, honestly, I didn't know, and it was really fascinating. So I'm really going to just do quick comments in three parts. I'm going to think about Hebrew labor historically. I'm going to think about the argument of labor and reparations, and then I'm going to make just a few comments at the end about the thing I know most about, but I'm going to speak least about, which is sort of architecture and archaeology, etc. Okay, so Stoneman begins with Andrew Ross's account of his visit to Kibbutz Genocide in the summer of 1979. That is, it begins precisely with that powerful icon of Hebrew labor, the kibbutz as its purest instantiation of the social experiment. That labor Zionism argued itself to be. The figure of the kibbutz and the project of Hebrew labor have long functioned as alibis for the legitimacy of the Israeli state. Rather than an act of colonial settlement, Israel and its icon, the kibbutz, is a radical socialist experiment, right? The power of that figure, I think, comes through quite clearly in the story with which Andrew begins. That is, working on a kibbutz, even as late as the year 1979. Even at that point, was not considered necessarily structurally or politically equivalent to moving to or working in a whites-only community in apartheid South Africa, for example. In its most strident iteration, a state built on Hebrew labor, a labor practice that not just prevented but rejected in its radical or extreme iteration, exploiting local labor, could not be considered colonial. It was constitutively a radically different project, a utopian experiment, and the persistence of that argument, I think, comes through in the importance of it, comes through very powerfully in your account of the Bauhaus of the work in the early 2000s to get parts of Tel Aviv recognized as a heritage site by UNESCO on the basis of it being Bauhaus architecture, which you show really as a retroactive account anyway. But because Bauhaus architecture itself was supposed to be a radical social experiment, right? Of course, the history that Andrew tells in Stoneman turns this story on its head. The conquest of labor, later to be framed as Hebrew labor, has a far more complex history than the standard narrative would suggest, and you track it in the book. The need to assure Jewish settlers a European living wage drove much of the need for Hebrew labor. That is the barring of Arabs from employment in Jewish enterprises. And more centrally, as the entire book elaborates, it was not Hebrew labor so much as Palestinian labor that built so much of the infrastructure and quite centrally the homes of and for, or the houses of and for the Jewish state. But before returning to that central thread of the argument, I just want to sketch a second, overlapping, but far less focused on genealogy of the commitment to Hebrew labor. As Andrew writes, and I quote, Gordon allegedly coined the slogan conquest of labor to evoke the personal struggle of Zionist settlers through manual toil on the land to bring forth the muscular personality of the new Jew, unquote. The muscular. The muscular was never just a matter of personality, of course. There's a growing body of work on Jewish race science from the late 19th through the early decades of the 20th century. That is, race science conducted by self-identified Jewish and Zionist social scientists in the decades during which Zionism also emerges. As this work has demonstrated, those scientists not only concurred with their Gentile counterparts that Jews are a race, they also accepted the notion that Jews are a degenerate race. Where they diverged was in their explanation. Jews were not inherently inferior. Their degeneracy was born of having lived for so long in unnatural conditions. That is, a race taken out of its proper environment, its homeland, and in unhealthy conditions, in exile. That is, in professions that detach them from actual labor. In other words, the Jewish race scientists were Lamarckians in their argument, that it's an environment, degeneracy was an environmental effect. It's worth drawing a line from Jewish racial thought then to Hebrew labor. Unlike the diaspora Jew who was weak and ill and who never engaged in any manual labor, the new Hebrew, to be born and made in Eretz Israel, would be physically strong, both a laborer and a soldier. And the masculinity of this, of course, is intense. There were several frameworks and struggles, in other words, that drove the commitment to Hebrew labor, and one of them was a clearly racial logic. Physicians and social scientists imagined a return to the land as simultaneously a national return, on the one hand, and a physical regeneration. That is, a return to manual labor. The return to manual labor and a connection to the land was framed as a solution to the problem of racial degeneracy. The Jewish race would be biologically reborn once it worked the land of Israel. So if Hebrew labor, the concept, signals a racial economy then, it's not just a racial economy in which Arab labor was to be kept out. There's a second register here, the racialization of the Jew and the eugenic imaginary through which the new Hebrew would be a hardier and healthier Jew than was his diasporic compatriot. Or dias, whatever, compatriot's right there. Okay, so let me return to the central narrative arc of the book. That is historical evidence does not sustain the idea that it is and was Hebrew labor that built, or builds today, the Jewish state and home. As one Palestinian quoted in the book remarks, quote, "We built close to 100% of Israeli homes," unquote. State building is read literally and to powerful effect in Stoneman. And I quote from Andrew. Palestinians' contribution to construction was stepped up during the modernizing wave of economic expansion under the British Mandate, and it continued after 1948 when the newly established State of Israel used their labor to help house the influx of Jewish immigrants. Since 1967, when the West Bank was secured as a reservoir of cheap labor, Israel's dependency on Palestinian workers has proved difficult to shake off, unquote. And insofar as the Israeli-built world, its very facts on the ground, have been constructed, by and large, by Palestinian labor, what kinds of political rights might that work of state building confer, which is, of course, where Andrew ended. The question of reparations then enters here, but not just as a replacement for rights lost and harms endured, think the German reparations for the Holocaust. Instead, and I quote again, "What have Palestinians earned collectively from these indispensable contributions? And how should these efforts be recognized in the political debate about the future of the lands of historic Palestine? What kinds of rights accrue from the century or more of toil they have devoted to the construction of the Zionist project. In contrast then, that's end of quote, in contrast then to reparative projects that, quote, aimed at, quote, repaying debts from the past, unquote, the book asks, quote, how can the remedies assist more directly in securing a different kind of future? The premise suggested in this book, I'm still quoting, that Palestinians have earned civil and political rights through the cumulative labor, presents one of the many pathways beyond the apartheid-style status quo. As momentum steadily builds behind some vision of a single democratic state within the same boundaries as historic Palestine, it ought to become more admissible that equity earned from building the state translates into political rights within it, unquote. So as the book unfolds then, and in kind of really elaborating sort of from the beginning, it begins with this question of labor and reparations, and it comes back to it at the end in very, I think, powerful ways. That's why I'm focusing it. As the book unfolds, though, I think the book deals with the question of labor and rights in many ways, but I'm going to focus on two ways that I want to disentangle for a moment. First, it maps the inequities of labor through the question of labor exploitation in a more classic sense, right? Arab wages are lower than Jewish wages. There is a lack of a minimum of a whole series of labor protections that are available to Jews alone in the early decades of the state, and post-67 only to those inside the Green Line, but not equally so. Not to Palestinians from across the Green Line who work inside Israel, not to migrant labor from elsewhere, etc. That narrative then leads us through a history of labor organizing, the history from which Arabs for decades were excluded, to Palestinian unions and their struggle against both Israeli and Palestinian employers, against the PA, the Israeli state, and the settlements post-Oslo, and to NGOs like Kevorkian Center, that fights on behalf of migrant workers in Israel, and not just Palestinians, both within and over the Green, and in others, not just Palestinians, but other kinds of migrant workers, both within and over the Green Line. The political fight here is for rights and protections as workers. And Andrew sees a way forward through this kind of organizing work. I was going to read a quote, but I left the book over there, where you sort of articulate that there's a possible future political possibility here by tracing the work of these kinds of new unions that work across the Green Line. Okay. But this is where I sort of pause in terms of the possibility of that kind of political organizing. So I guess I'm not convinced that this kind of traditional labor left politics, let alone the NGOization of the fight for rights, and some of these groups are kind of classic NGOs, is likely to lead to a radical political future, although I'm going to come back to where I see that at the end. Why not? So I thought I would have time today to think more systematically about this, and I didn't. So I'm just going to throw out my view, totally incorrect. Most centrally, I think the Jewish working class in Israel today is not leftist, not to any plausible extent. Zionist leftism, whatever it is, has become deeply bourgeois. And of course, Zionism itself, including of working classes, precludes the kind of non-Zionist joint organizing that Andrew wants to imagine here, as a continuation of the non-Zionist socialists and communists who envisioned joint projects in the early decades of the 20th century. Although if I can pause once again here, that's another thing I sometimes, and this is really an aside, but I'm just going to do it, I also have a bit of pause about, it almost strikes me sometimes that the romance of the kibbutz, as that romance died, because it was hard to sustain, right? I worry sometimes that kind of socialist romance now gets placed on these very small groups in pre-1948 Palestine that were socialists and communists who imagined organizing Arabs and Jews together. And the reason for that I'm skeptical of resuscitating that is not only because numerically they were actually insignificant, but they were still settlers, right? I mean, on what grounds did these European Jews move to Palestine and then decide to organize? I'm also I think there's a more critical history of that needs to be kind of rewritten. But, so, there's the problem of to what extent the working class in Israel could ever be mobilized to a kind of joint radical political project here on the grounds of class. But the second thing is I also wonder if we need to think more, and this is what I just haven't thought about systematically at all, not just about the overlaps, but also the distinctions between what you called even now migrant workers and migrant workers in their own lands, right? The colonized and in effect captured labor pool. How does one think the colonial and the stateless in relation to and also as distinct from the neoliberal. And I think it might be worth having that conversation. So in other words, even the project of organizing foreign migrant labor inside Israel with Palestinian labor, I think there are ways in which there are things that obviously converge, but those are radically different political struggles, so I'm not sure where we would land at the other end. Okay. The second labor story traced here, or traces domain, is more directed at an analysis of collective national political rights, even though within one state. This isn't a call for two states. Born of having built the Jewish state, which I think is really interesting. Reading Palestinian labor, and in particular the labor of and in construction, via this collective lens is a powerful way of reframing reparations as a demand for rights upon the state into a different future. This is a claim not just that there is a moral debt to be paid, as I think you laid out really nicely, not just that there is something in the present that remains unresolved. It is a far more radical claim. How does one think reparations in the midst of an ongoing conflict, in the midst of a war, and in relation to a settler nation whose final status, borders, and legitimacy are far from settled? Right? And conversations about reparations and reconciliation are often in the aftermath. There's a legacy. This isn't a legacy. This is a contemporary, incredibly unsettled state. This is a demand then that takes seriously the notion that the Nakba is ongoing in the everyday lives of those who continue to be displaced and continue to build the homes and other infrastructures for those that continue to displace them. In other words, taking seriously Patrick Wolf's turn of phrase that a settler nationhood is a structure, not an event. And it's a powerful way of reframing the right of return. To return to the Palestinian interlocutor who argued that Palestinians have built close to 100% of Israeli homes, and let me quote, "For me, it's not a matter of compensation. It's more about the right for the refugees to return. I feel we have all earned the right for the refugees to return," unquote. Work, in other words, may stand at the center of these claims, but workers hold no privileged right as workers. Those rights are conferred on Palestinians as a whole. Okay, so finally I just want to say a few words about stones and heritage. I might skip the big first part because I'm going on too long. Okay, so I was thinking about the renovation of houses in Jaffa. And on the one hand, yeah, it mimics a turn to preservation and Euro-American world of these beautiful old cities that, frankly, as I said in my book, but the renovation of the Jewish quarter in Jerusalem to me looks like what a New Yorker thinks an old city should look like, but we'll leave that aside. But I also think it's a sign of is it a sign of having won? In other words, what's specific here? That it's no longer necessary to deny that there were Palestinians in Jaffa, that their homes were destroyed and they were displaced. That's just another fact on the ground, so to speak. And I've thought about this a lot in terms of sort of the 1980s and 90s. There was a kind of optimism about the post-Zionist historiography, and if you open the archives and the facts would emerge, and then we argued with Benny Morris about whether it was an accident or intentional, but actually we've come to the point where it doesn't matter at all. So if you think about Ahi Shavit, for anybody who's read Ahi Shavit's book, My Promised Land, which was received here as this extraordinarily ethical, liberal reckoning with 1948, he basically argues, yeah, it was terrible. Yeah, we expelled everybody from Lidda. Yeah, I'm traumatized, but I'd do it again. I had no choice. In other words, the Nakba is normalized as another necessary fact of state building, and I think that that is what allows the reappropriation of these properties. It doesn't have to be denied anymore. And then finally, I just want to say something about the heritage preservation, the work of groups like Fieldwork, et cetera. On the one hand, I totally understand the urgency and the dedication of the project, and I think one of the most interesting things is the recreations of a possibility of a commons in village spaces. At the same time, I keep saying this, I'm not as optimistic about that the relationship between restoration and heritage designation as a way to secure the future, as a way to defend against land confiscation. And I guess, one hand, what effective difference does it make if UNESCO declares certain places heritage sites? The seizure of land, I think, will go on no matter what. Moreover, what stones and sites symbolize, of course, isn't given by the stones in or by the stones themselves. So is this Palestinian architecture? Is it traditional architecture? Is it, as you talk about, a biblical, in the Jerusalem context, a biblical Oriental aesthetic, unquote? The slippage in post-1967 Jerusalem between those terms was essential for rebuilding the old city as a kind of instantiation of Jewish return, right? It relied heavily on identifying traditional Oriental architecture that would never be named Arab, right? Those same stones could signal the authenticity of the Jewish state and thus substantiate Jewish return, precisely through the names to which specific histories of Arab and Muslim Palestine relied in. Okay, I think I'm going to end there.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Nadia. This is this working? Is this on?
Yeah.
This is really, it's just wonderful to be here. I'm not a regional specialist. I work mostly on Latin America and the United States, but this really is a remarkable book. It's just, it's heartbreaking. It's just this stunning mix of ethnography and analysis and participant observation that really brings together in almost. It's hard to think of another. I just thought it's analytical. It's the empathy and the analysis, but also the bringing together of symbolic and social and material relations of this kind of settler colonialism. It's the stone itself, as Andrew laid out in his presentation and in the book itself. I had no idea. I had no idea that quarrying and stone building was such this resource, this white gold, was such a central industry and such a foundational social relation of Palestinian identity, of Palestinian social relations. It's Andrew, I don't know if you said this at the beginning in your presentation, but you said in the book that it's the 2014 Palestinians were the 12th largest stone producers in the world. Mm-hmm. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely.
And when you think of the conditions in which that production is taking place, it's stunning, right? There's people occupied, fragmented, dominated, and the 12th largest producers of stone in the world. And just the materiality of that is such a remarkable entry point into the conflict, into this history. And it's through this kind of long life of stone that, in some ways, Andrew, the fact that it could be destroyed, but it can't be disposed of. The stone itself, and then all of when you think about that could be destroyed, it could be broken up, but it can't be disposed of. Andrew gives us something like a first law of social dynamics. With stone, like people, can be broken, they can be ground down, but they endure in new forms, as cement, as weapons, as ruins. And the book Stone then captures this dynamic in stunning terms. Really, the oppositions that they lend to, the building and the destruction, the nostalgia, the oblivion, the memory and the forgetting. It runs through those tensions, and those oppositions run through the whole book in this century-long history. Andrew maps stonework onto the process of colonization, and it symbolizes this fight between, or this tension and conflict between the old and the new, right? And this kind of settler colonial brutalism, the idea that early Zionists thought they could just cement themselves out of the past, they could just pour themselves into the future, right? And they could not have that, they could transcend this all of the symbolism that the stone houses represented, but also the dependency on labor and the social dependency, and as part of the foundation of this kind of settler colonial Lockeanism that values labor and fetishizes the myth of independence and self creation. And then later, as that high period of Israeli modernization sours after 1967, the nostalgia that sets in for the old stone buildings as a way of laying claim to the land. Andrew talks about particularly stones with vintage appearance, which suggests a kind of authentic, long-standing connection to the land. And here, I thought, this mimicry. I thought, I couldn't help thinking of. There's a book from 1966, Norman Brown's Love's Body, And he talks about fraternal genocide. He talks about the mimicry of fraternal genocide. He talks about two different kinds of mimicry. One is the mimicry that occurs at the moment of foundation, the violence involved in the subordination and the domination and the creation of a new state. And then and the way that mimicry, and he's talking specifically about the United States and the mimicry of white rangers who adopt the kind of symbols and ways of warfare of Native America. And that's a way of laying claim to the land, right? The land becomes, it becomes a way of laying inheritance to the land, in some kind of manner. But then he also talks about the mimicry. But then Brown talks about the way in which this kind of Lockean settler colonialism that fetishizes value-added labor denies that violence and refuses to because it's part of the refusal to acknowledge the dependency and the emphasis on self-creation and independence. That there's the mimicry of what happens, as Nadia said, after defeat, after victory in the case of settler colonialism, and this kind of that fraternal genocide then becomes represented in a nostalgia for a lost world, for a lost people, the subjugated people, and that book is very Freudian and diaphanous in its analysis, and Andrew's book is very material. But in some ways, it's a nice kind of compliment, right? There's a certain kind of, it's the most, stone and stonemen. It's the opposite of diaphanous, right? It's the most material of material. And one keeps coming back to in reading the book, the hardness and the inescapability of stone, right? And this idea that the early Zionists could escape from the social dependency and from history, first becoming the idea that they could extract the knowledge of stone artisanship themselves and dispense with local skill, and then escape it through the idea of poured, flowed concrete, poured cement, this kind of settler colonial brutalism, along with other forms of extra-nationalized subsidies in order to somehow break free of what they imagined to be what was the dependency that they had on Arab labor. But there was no escape, right? There was no transcendence from the stone. After 1967, Andrew writes that the direction of Zionist flight away from the heritage of the region went into reverse, and there was the emergence of this nice turn of phrase, the Ottomania, where in the past the whole legacy of Ottoman Palestine was to be obliterated through kind of cement modernism. Now there was this return to a celebration, evaluation of antiquity. And Nadia talks about this in her book, and she talked about it in her presentation, as well as in the more secular real estate realm. All right, the gentrifiers developed an appreciation for antique walls. So on that symbolic level, the focus on stone and the stone workers and artisans works extremely well. But then there's also thinking about, I think, the way that the success of the book and the power of the book is that the way it articulates with social relations and ultimately the foundation of labor relations, and thinking about the Nakba as an ongoing process of labor dispossession. Again, as somebody who, maybe Andrew could talk about this in the follow-up, but the overwhelming sense of the conflict is around land and around the dispossession of land and land theft and settlement. But what does it mean to think about it as the century-long process of labor dispossession? Reading about it was so familiar. There was these, and again, there's the thinking to go back to the symbolic realm. That was the way thinking about the earlier kibbutz attempt to establish some kind of solidarity or imagined solidarity with Palestinian artisans and stone workers, and to what degree, but they were still settlers, and that's the first stage of mimicry that accompanies the foundation of the Israeli state. But to think about the Nakba as an ongoing process of labor dispossession and the capturing of artisanal knowledge, and the way you lay it out is so skillful in the ebb and flow of realizations of the dependency, and then attempts to figure out ways to transcend the dependency, and whether it be bringing in migrant laborers, but then the constant return to the need for the stone itself and the skill involved in the stone. It's really in some ways a kind of, there's almost a perfect mapping. It's almost, again, something else that I was thinking and reading the book kept on returning to was Hegel's, Lord and bondsman parable. But as the whole apparatus of colonialism gets segmented onto it, the whole checkpoint system and what was the phrase that you used at the beginning for compulsory workforce, the creation of a compulsory workforce. Yeah, it's just such a striking way to think about the history of Palestine. It just works so well. And more than anything else, it was, I think, your ability to kind of pick up and listen with this kind of empathy, this ethnographic empathy to the quotations of the book are striking. I mean, the one that you referred to, they demolish our houses while we build theirs, and they demolish our houses. Wait, they demolish our houses while we build their homes? No, wait, what's the other way around? They demolish our homes while they build theirs. And there's another. If we didn't work inside Israel, we would have to eat each other. It was the talk about the kind of thinking about labor, the compulsion of the cannibalistic compulsion of labor, and it was striking about the free. Maybe you could speak a little bit more about the where that basic law 21 comes from.
Oh yeah.
Is that it's in a charter? It's in the Palestinian
Yeah, it's part of the Oslo.
Part of the Oslo thing, and I guess that was the high point of a lot of the free market.
Well, it comes a little later, really, with the Fayed era, after 2008,
Right.
the IMF
Right.
era.
But
But it's there,
Yeah.
it's there in the basic law.
And again, the contrast between the facts on the ground and the reality, and the extra economic compulsion to work, and that image of the worker climbing over the cortina wire is just to get. I mean, that's just their daily commute is over that barbed wire.
Well, that's
Okay.
a shortcut.
That's a shortcut.
Coming back. You can't go over that way unless.
That's a
you go
shortcut
over illegally.
in order to claw back a little
get
bit of
that.
free time, a little bit of life, rather
Yeah.
than everything being subordinated to the workday or to sleep.
Yeah.
It's just really stunning. I mean, I'll just leave it at that because I think that we'll probably have a lot of questions and discussion from the audience. But I just wanted to congratulate you on a really, really wonderful book.
Just very quickly, I really want to thank both of you for those comments. They really raised the quality of the conversation. It sounds as if you got the stone virus.
Yeah.
Really.
Stone.
I became a bit of a stone fetishist in doing this project, not knowing really much about stone at all. But I remembered after, really in the course of writing, and this often happens, I'm sure you've had this experience in your research that underpins how personal your research is, but you don't realize it until there's a certain point in a project. And I remembered how a lot of my youth had been spent on construction sites, and in particular working in a precast concrete factory. One of my brothers was an accountant in that firm, and so I really remembered the smell of the cement and what it felt like to shovel the cement and so on and so forth. And really, the accoutrements and the tools of the trade that really hadn't changed all that much, really, for a lot of the workers that I was interviewing in a completely different part of the world many decades later. The stone is, of course, I mean, one thing I haven't mentioned really is the safety safety hazards and the actual the occupational hazards of working with stone.
Dust.
Yeah, and this is something workers were loath really to talk about very publicly. Some of my interviews were cluster interviews of workers in their homes and villages in the celebrated stone villages, and they were very reluctant to talk about this publicly, but it clearly was a huge cause for concern. And in particular, the role of cancer. A lot of these occupational ailments are well documented. And one acquaintance of mine who works in the Beit Jala Hospital in Bethlehem told me that up to 80% of the cases at any one time in the hospital are men from these stone villages, and the conditions really do correlate with these well-known symptoms of occupational hazards. So it's it's a kind of poison chalice in a way. This industry, given how dependent economically Palestinians are upon it, but the lack of enforcement of regulations on the part of the authorities really is sickening the workforce. Greg mentioned John Locke a few times in passing, and I wanted to throw that into my response to you, Nadia, because a lot of the talk and analysis of racial science that underpins the context you were describing really doesn't make reference to the labor theory of property, which basically is Locke's doctrine that drives settler colonialism in North America. And it's really only in the last 10 or 15 years or so, with the emergence of the sort of paradigm of settler colonialism, that scholars in my discipline in particular, American studies, there's a sort of thriving subsector of American studies now devoted to Palestinian studies as a result of that sort of shared lens in a way. And I think the argument, I mean, to be honest, the arguments I was laying out at the end about sweat equity are a version, in a way, of the labor theory of property, given that one of the major forms of property is in rights. There's a lot more to be said about that, and I don't think it sort of dooms. I don't think it dooms the claim, but I make the claim in a very speculative way. I'm not really qualified to carry it very far, so I just sort of lay it on the table at the end of the book and hope that people will pick it up who are more qualified than I am in a way. And one quick point in response to your comments about the conservatism and the reactionary nature of a lot of the Israeli working class. Of course, it's not a unified class formation. It's a highly ethnically stratified. Mizrahi Jews and Israeli Palestinians are part of that working class. And in addition, I think there's a lot of conservatism on the part of the West Bank Palestinian working class, especially in the construction industry. I think we have that problem in this country too. Some of the most reactionary trade union tendencies are in the construction trades. It's just a vocation that is so welded to growth. And so many of the workers that I talk to, I mean, they realize that the growth of the settlements is employment for them. I mean, when new settlements are announced, they know it's employment. It's horrible. It's very painful and very humiliating thing to recognize. But it's true, and it's a very material part of their livelihoods in a way. So, I kept thinking, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, as you were speaking. But it would be my pathetic but still resonant response overall.
If I could, do I need this?
Yeah, sure.
Because I was going to say, I think I completely get that the reparations, sweat equity thing is right, that you're putting it out there. But I think partly what's powerful is exactly the way you laid this out, which is because it shifts from land, I mean, insofar as it's about building the state, it never really separates land from labor. But insofar as rather than making an argument about dispossession from land, one is making an argument based upon really taking apart this central myth of the Israeli state, which is that Hebrew labor built the state. That's where the sweat equity thing becomes different than the kind of claim that would be made for, let's say, here, where like the labor, there wasn't a denial of labor that people who built the state. So I think that's the creative move there, is it also just really flips that narrative entirely and says, well, in fact, the state was not built by Hebrew labor, right? And it goes to the heart of a certain ideological thing. The only other, can I say one other thing, which is that I also found this part on brutalism and concrete in Tel Aviv very powerful. It is what Tel Aviv looks like. But the one thing I just do also, I think that I don't think there's as much of a radical shift between pre-1967 and post-1967. First of all, to view kind of the building of the state through Tel Aviv Tel Aviv was a very particular city, and it was very much that's where that kind of futuristic project was most imagined. But a lot of people, like Susan Slimovich's work on the object of memory, a lot of people moved into Palestinian homes in villages in West Jerusalem, etc. So there was always that turn to the past. Tel Aviv was just one, or whatever the past, to the existing architecture that was valued. And obviously, as you know, and I've written about extensively, the kind of turn to antiquity was essential in the first, pre-state through the 40s and 50s was in fact the height of architecture. I mean, of archaeology. The post-67 digs are the last of the huge national digs, right? And then retroactively, one can read the post-1967 digs as the rise of religious nationalism. But at the time, it was very much secular labor Zionism that invested in those digs, right? It was like the culmination of a turn to the past that always coexisted with this brutalist, forward-looking. Because that's, again, return was the ideology, right? Not settlement.
Shall we invite comments or questions from the floor? Nasser, do you want to field these, or shall I?
Sure. I
think you should
try to take a few at a time.
the master of the room.
Thank you so much. I look forward to reading the book. So you had a quote earlier from a worker who said that we build their houses and then demolish our homes. What was the terminology used in Arabic?
I don't speak Arabic. I don't know.
Okay.
I had translators with me all the time.
Okay. Because,
Maybe Nadia.
well, I mean, you
Why
can
not?
guess
They
that
said,
you can
Based
guess that
on
it might be Beit al-Manzil.
Or the,
But-
or the
But you find it a striking citation, even though you sort of translate the validation of house and home
Yeah,
to English.
it was pointed out to me by the translator.
What-
This was a distinction.
What is it you find striking about this validation, like the implied validation between house and home?
I read this in a fairly straightforward manner. That these were, there was a certain artificiality about the Israeli house, and it didn't have roots.
Yeah.
It didn't have roots.
Yeah,
It was
it
not
did, yeah.
invested.
And it
You
will
wanna-
pass, yeah.
You want to expand on that?
Not really. But
Oh. I thought you were going to.
Let's try
I don't want to get in trouble here.
Oh, no, you won't get in trouble. I think,
The house doesn't have roots, the Israeli house does.
yeah, and the homes, the Palestinian homes are invested with sort of centuries. They're rooted and they're invested with centuries of significance of settled residence. And so plus, I think there's also, and not over-reading, but perhaps I am, sense that this land is our home. You're building houses
Yeah.
on the land, but this land is actually our home.
Yeah, it will remain
and
our
that's what's
home,
being
yeah, that's what I
demolished.
think it means, yeah.
Does that make sense? Yeah?
Sure,
It
yeah.
does.
But I would sort of maybe hesitate to make a direct translation between what house and home means in English and
I
then
take your
Arabic
point.
context. But also then because you talked about what you call the psychology of masculinity of the workers or something like that. But maybe it was very obvious, but you didn't really elaborate on it. But in which way is this related to this notion of them building houses that are like not themselves.
Can we take a couple of questions then,
Yeah,
just
sure.
before you dive into that? Because, there were a lot of hands, and we won't get through them.
So you brought up kind of this discussion of the revival of like the antiquity, Jewish antiquity of vintage looking homes with the stone. Is that considered a cross-class thing? So how fiscally feasible is the stone for different classes within Israel? Because as far as I know, within Amman, limestone is considered kind of a social symbol. It's a status of a higher class. So what does that look like within Israel? Because Tel Aviv is obviously a very different city than Amman.
Was another question?
I actually always wondered where the stone came from, which is funny now that I had never thought an answer. But you know, in Israel, especially if you're an American Jew in Israel, everything has a story. Like, you know, everything has a backstory that's intended to sort of cement the narrative, and there was never any narrative for Jerusalem stone. So I just wonder if in your travels you had conversations with Israeli Jews or with Zionists generally about, and if you had if you had assessed a place for the stone in that narrative. Is there like a piece about the extraction or like the sort of undervalued labor of Palestinians that becomes part of the story of settlement to the Zionist side?
Well, I didn't do any of that interviewing. It was really beyond the orbit of the research. But I do cover the debate about the branding of Jerusalem stone, which is much contested. And in particular, the only stone producer left in Israel, the Grabelsky Company, which has a couple of quarries, and they've been producing since the 1920s. They're part of that contested story about who fashioned the brand, which is a very, very powerful and lucrative brand. But the irony is that one of the big ironies of the stone industry in the West Bank is that the mainstay of the industry is this 1918 ordinance that the British governor of Jerusalem, Ronald Storrs, issued, that all of the buildings in Jerusalem had to be faced with this local limestone. And to this day, it's still observed. I mean, it's more observed now for political reasons, because the spreading suburbs of Jerusalem, I mean, the orbit of what's imagined as Greater Jerusalem, which stretches into the West Bank now, everything is built in the uniforms, with the uniform look and appearance and aesthetic of this stone. So it's everywhere you go. And there's a kind of consistency to it, which is supposed to resonate with the message of, unified, undivisible Jerusalem. And quite frankly, that's one of the reasons why there is this great demand for the West Bank stone. It has to be built with this stone. In Tel Aviv, less so. Tel Aviv doesn't have the same aesthetic, as Nadia pointed out, and there's a lot of aesthetic rivalry between the two cities, especially in Jaffa, where the decision makers have decided it's supposed to look like a sort of quaint Mediterranean haven, and quite distant and remote from Jerusalem. I've forgotten what your question was. Remind me very quickly.
So basically, how fiscally feasible is this like limestone architecture within the state of Israel?
Oh yeah. But, I mean, as far as I could see, it really was a sort of luxury question of luxury pricing on the real estate market. The oldest stone is fetching the highest prices. It's whatever the market can bear, but the antiquity of the stone, all you need to do really is look at the Sotheby's ads for a lot of these restored buildings, and that's what they zero in on, the antiquity of the stone, in addition to the sea views, which are a big feature, of course, of the Mediterranean real estate in Jaffa. It's obviously something that is very class stratified as
But
a taste.
But as you also point out, So there's stone buildings, but then there's the stone facade,
Mhm.
right? So all of Jerusalem's built in facade, and all the settlements around Jerusalem, which are not right, which are subsides, they're all built, but it's like the layer you put over the concrete as opposed to the whole building.
Yeah, a lot of it is 6 centimeter cladding.
Yeah.
And even with the revival of Kurkar in Jaffa, you can cut some corners. I mean, you can produce a Kurkar cladding facade that passes muster according to the architectural guidelines.
Okay, yeah, we have time for a couple more.
Could you say more about the relationships between the careful competition firm, the village-based sort of operations, and the basic, the also are sort of, it was not a cartel, but a kind of Patico, yeah. What the relationships were between those two, and then also Gulf Capital in, particularly given the investment of Gulf Capital in construction in Ramallah, if the stone was also being used in those developments, and whether that affects then your sort of distinction of comprador capitalism the comprador capitalism of Patico with the sort of yeah. Say about that. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, in terms of ownership, I didn't find any overlap at all. There really are just these small family firms. I mean, some of them very small. Some of them have scaled up. Nasar is the biggest one in Bethlehem, and they do export because they are scaled up and they have the capitalization. But the crony capitalists don't seem to have a lot of interest in taking over parts of that industry for whatever reason. That said, of course, the construction, the pell-mell construction in a place like Ramallah, which are being financed internationally, it depends entirely upon that stone supply. So that's where there is the overlap. And the most interesting site, of course, is Rawabi. There's a portion of my book that is focused on Rawabi, this huge new city on a hill that is being built by Bashar al-Masri, who belongs to one of the most monopolistic of all of the crony capitalist families. And he speaks a very fine line on nationalism. And he's generated a lot of jobs, a huge number of jobs and employment in Rawabi. But it's a very strange place because basically to afford an apartment in Rawabi, you need a certain income, which is much higher than the average Palestinian income. And it's a place where the long-term mortgage loan has been introduced most forcibly and most visibly in the West Bank. If you go to the sales room in Rawabi, up there on the hill, there are several banks, and you walk in and you talk to the banker, and they figure out whether they're going to give you a loan or not. And it's quite an extraordinary scenario, because here, who could imagine in this patch of ground that's under military occupation and so constrained in every respect, mobility and every aspect of economic stability constrained, that you could have a thriving long-term mortgage loan economy. It's sort of proof that financial capitalism can really operate and thrive anywhere. It's a very good example of that, and it's definitely a line of research for some of our graduate students to follow. I see Tarek at the back here who's interested in that.
Good.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for the talk. I sort of more of a theoretical question. Unfortunately, for such a painful topic that is contemporary, but I was surprised to hear about the free market line in the Palestinian constitution. And I wonder if there was any American pressure during Oslo, post-Oslo, but that's not the actual question. If there was to be a one secular state from river to the sea equally for the Israeli Jew and the Palestinians, and if workers following the Marxist dictum had ownership of the production, at least partly, I wonder, after decades of the humiliation you mentioned, would they be willing to, when the power imbalance is kind of gone politically speaking, of course this is theoretical, would they be willing to work for kind of Jewish customers, or would their economy be more isolated? You know, we want to build our own communities now. In other words, without the profit incentives provided to individuals by the free market system, do you believe Palestinians and Jews would be able to share a single national economy?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, it's kind of above my pay level to speculate about that. But to some extent, I think the two parts of your comment are related. You know, the degree to which the market economy enjoys that kind of supremacy and uncontested supremacy in a future state. There is a lot of convergence, I think, between, you know, the sort of oligarchic concentration of wealth, both in Israel and in the West Bank, among a few families, and is reflected in the statistics, the Gini coefficient statistics. As for the future, again, I feel I want to punt this to Nadia, but that would be unfair. So let's just let our imaginations run riot here. And again, optimism of
The only thing I would say is that the one thing that might make you optimistic about the failures of the free market fantasy is, other than the oligarch class, it's not clear to me that it's generating at the moment a desire for Palestinians and Jews to participate in the same economy. It's not working. I mean, that's not what's happening. I mean, there are the classes that have benefited from Oslo on both sides, but at a broad population level, there's not some fantasy that this is a shared economy. It's a compulsory participation. I mean, it's that what you trace is far more complex than an idea that there's a shared.
And probably more profitable. I mean, the occupation regime is so good for business. And just from the point of labor, you know, why would Israeli employers prefer Palestinian labor from the West Bank at this point? There are many reasons, not just the original ones. They're cheaper, they're better, their labor politics are less strident, their demands are less strident. They also go home every night. Unlike the migrant workers who are still there in large numbers in Israel, there's no social cost, there's no burden on the state. And perhaps most importantly, the wages, the Palestinian wages, are spent on Israeli goods in the West Bank at Israeli prices. So they don't go elsewhere in the form of remittances to other countries, which is the case with the migrant workers. And another reason I would mention, I think, and this is a sort of more of a long-term movement, the more and more workers that are transferred off the land into wage labor, it makes it easier, makes the land more vulnerable, and makes it easier to seize. So for all these reasons, these workers really are the goose that lays the golden eggs for employers on both sides of the Green Line, because a lot of Palestinian middlemen involved in this labor traffic on both sides of the Green Line.
Okay, I just want to add before you all leave that now that we've got the sales pitch, we are selling the book outside at a very competitive price. I'm not sure if it competes with the Jeff Bezos racket, but it's probably a fair bit more ethical. There is also wine and cheese, and with that, please.
Yeah, no, he's requested but he's 3 times today. I'm really sorry. No, it's okay. Can I get up? Yeah, right.